Hey, I'm Anthony Rainey here with Austin Harig, and Austin, you ran for school board, and that was 2016. What was the year that you ran for school board? I'm sorry.
My bigger race was in 2016. I also went for it in 2019, though. That wasn't as successful, though.
Thank
But,
you.
you know.
So, how do you feel about the elections that are happening locally this year, November?
So, the big thing with it is there's not a lot of movement going on besides in the West District, which we'll get a little bit more into. And I think you are going to see some change when it comes to the school board, at least. There are some new faces. Um, But for the most part, most of these candidates are running unopposed. You don't really have major races going on in any of the how many districts is it? I believe it's six, right? I believe it's
Yeah,
six for
six
the
and then
school.
three at large.
Yep, six districts, and there's only a competitive race in one. So I do think I do think that's not great for, candidate choice, right? Obviously more people should run for office. It helps to have competitive elections rather than just anointments. But it is where we are. And obviously, there is one competitive race in the West District, at least, where at least in my view, all of the candidates are wildly qualified. Um, you have Jen McCosey, who's a solid community activist. She has her history in Push Buffalo. She's backed by the teachers union, and you can find Jen in a lot of grassroots movements just around town. I actually bumped into Jen in the No Kings protest just a few weeks ago. So you can find Jen around, and I think that's part of her flair. She's rather accessible. Talia
I think that's true.
Talia's
I think that Jen is accessible. I agree with that. It's ironic. I actually bumped into Jen with my daughter at the No Kings rally as well.
Yeah. Talia, she has a great background. I mean, her actual position on some of the policies, I think she's a little bit more school choice, which, when I ran with the BTF endorsement. Um, so I mean, I think there's a healthy balance to it, but I think that when one candidate's like pro union and another's, pro charter, and that's just all they do. I do think that there becomes some issues with it when it just comes to how money is being appropriated and stuff like that. Obviously, in the optimal world, you'd like candidates where they have a balanced perspective on both sides, but we don't really get that. Um, so you have your pro union candidate, your pro teachers union, and then you have school choice. And lastly, Abdo, I don't know too much about him, but he ran a rather strong campaign in the
2022.
last time, if I'm not mistaken. Right, he got about 30% of the vote, which isn't which isn't a huge amount. It wasn't a close race, but clearly he has some supporters and he comes from a unique background, so I think he's got that going for him.
Yeah, I mean that's a huge turnout in terms of I think the first election that he ran.
Yep. And I do think it may now that this is a three-way race with Abdo, um, you know, depending on depending on how strong his base of, if he has a solid 35 if he has a solid like 35% that will vote for him no matter what, I think that he could really be a dark horse candidate, but it depends on how the cards fall. Obviously, Jen has a lot of supporters too, And it seems like some of the Latino community is going towards Talia. So
I did
it,
see the Latino Village did, I think, endorse Talia and Betty Jean Grant, I think.
yeah. So that could see the thing is though that could again like that sort of like opens up the door, if there's just a certain proportion of votes that are going to go to one candidate, it could lead to just one of them taking it away with like 30% of the vote, depending on 33%, depending on where it goes, which would not be the greatest situation, but that is the reality of first past the post, is that we could get a result like that where two candidates um split a demographic, and you just get someone who runs up the middle.
Yeah, we've seen it before locally with the state senate election. I remember back in I think 2014, and I think it was Mark Grisanti for my state senate district. But either way, going back to the school board, do you think there's any specific issue that you would like to see the school board tackle?
Um, let's see. Well, I mean, obviously, we could do better in terms of our state test scores, in terms of getting. I think in general, I like the direction things are going. They have a new superintendent, so I find it to be important, how a candidate is going to work with that superintendent to get results, for these young people, right? Um, and I think that's really the big thing. I think we've got a very qualified superintendent, right? We know, and Makosi has touted, how she's able to work with the superintendent. I am curious to see, how Talia or Mr. Abdo would do with them. But I think that's really the big thing. The board's going to have a couple newcomers. I believe we've got Eric Bowen and Park, right? And he's more on the charter side as well, if I'm not mistaken, because Eric Bowen was the campaign manager for Carl Palladino years ago. So you may start to see some change in the dynamic, but I think that's what's most important for the public schools is working with the superintendent and seeing what we can do to bring up bring up the education for all of these young people, and that includes reaching out to all areas of the city. We still do have issues with some schools being just objectively better than others, and kids in some areas not really having access to the better schools in the city, right? Just by virtue of design. And I think that's unfortunate, but it is sort of the unofficial way things have gone. I think they've done a little bit to combat that in recent years, but still, you do have a lot of disparity, in someone who's getting their education at, say, East versus someone who's getting it at Hutch Tech, City Honors, or one of the more prestigious schools. But you can trace this back to what elementary schools these kids are getting, right? Look at Discovery School, for instance. I'm a graduate of Discovery School in South Buffalo. And the fact is, if kids are getting better elementary educations, if they're doing better on the elementary level, then they're going to take up all the seats in these better schools and leave the. So we need to address the resource disparity, and I mean, we've been talking about that since 2016, though, and it still exists. I think it's easy to talk about it, right? It's harder to actually take action on it, because of, just hard blocks like people being in poverty and stuff like that, right? Poverty is a huge driver for things like this. But I think in general, we want to give this new superintendent a chance. We want to work with their policies, see where it's going to go. And then also, it does come down. I think the city school district could do a little bit better in terms of working to retain good talent when they get it. I know of in one case there was an amazing principal who got um who got taken over to Kenmore because they were doing a great job in the Buffalo Public Schools, right? So, of course, they were a star recruit for Kenmore. And, that's what happened. I think that we could do, like, when you have upcoming stars like that, we could do better to retain them in the city school district to have them continue doing well for the city kids as well.
I mean, I can see how that's frustrating if, someone's building up a good repertoire within the district and then they move out of the district for, maybe better opportunity or whatever the reason may be. That leaves a gap of that, communication and team building that happened before that transition. Um, Now, in terms of like the test scores, can you think of any like small ways that like a school board might be able to help raise the student scores?
Um, well, I mean, the biggest driver of it is just ensuring that there are or that you have good staffing ratios of kids to teachers, right? So that each kid can get the individual attention that they need to do well, and some need more than others, right? So I think that's going to be your big driver. Um,
Does that
you
include like
may
having
want to
enough
do
aides
better.
too, like teacher aides?
Teacher aides. Yes, and then also resource officers, truancy and things like that can still turn out to be a big issue, especially in districts where there's poverty, right? You know, so I think that that's something also to look at. You want to have good resource officers, and optimally, you want to be keeping them for years so that they have a relationship with that community as well. I think that the key to building up the Buffalo Public Schools is getting good employees and retaining them for the long haul, and basically working from there to lift up the populace, right? And you've got to do this in the good schools, and you've also got to do it in the schools um, where people are more struggling, right? I think that even teachers covet positions at some of the better schools. You might see even movement within the Buffalo Public Schools, right? But at the end of the day, I think that really, wanna if you want to talk about little things, right? I think that little things start at the individual person, right? And so, just having good employees, good teachers aides who are there in a school and are working towards building it. I think that that's probably one of the best ways, just lower churn, lower lower movement, things like that.